May 6, 1950. Entropy. Introduction. I will talk to you first of all about the idea of entropy in physics. The older physicists thought that the universe was necessarily dying because the sun was giving out heat and the planets were warming up gradually, so that the time would come when there was no interchange of energy in the form of heat between the sun and the planets. Now the work taught at the beginning of this century that the sun was getting hotter and everything was growing, not dying. It is clear that if the sun were getting colder and the earth getting hotter, after a time they would be of equal temperatures and no exchange of energy would take place. This condition is called maximal entropy. It means that there is no interchange of energy between two things. The older physicists taught a continual increase of entropy until a maximum was reached where nothing could happen, for, in order that anything can happen, a flow of energy from one thing to another is necessary. This is a brief note to introduce a short paper about decreasing entropy by work on oneself. The idea of entropy, taken psychologically. We speak once more after a long time about entropy. We have already noticed how occasionally modern scientific ideas and conceptions correspond, in a way, with the esoteric ideas of this system as, for example, the idea of a growing universe, increasing in energy and size, which is common to both. Now if you have a kettle full of hot water close to a kettle full of cold water in an enclosed space, the hot kettle will give its heat to the cold kettle, and after a time they will reach a similar temperature. That means that no exchange of energy will then take place between them. Such a condition as was mentioned is called maximal entropy. No one can define what entropy means, but we can see that minimal entropy will initially be present when you have something at a very high energy level, so force will flow from one to the other. When no further interchange of energy takes place between the two things, you have maximal entropy and therefore, so to speak, death. Yes, and psychologically speaking, I mean psychological death. Now supposing that we try to translate this into psychological language. Here is a man who no longer takes in impressions. He is uninterested. He is bored and hates everything. What is the state of his psychological entropy? It is nearly maximal. I mean, he does not exchange anything with either the outer world or his inner world of thoughts and feelings. If you call the outer world the hot kettle and the inner world the cold kettle, then, as long as he is bored, he will not take in impressions or force from the hot kettle. After a time, the outer hot kettle and the inner receptive kettle no longer have interchange. Once they are brought into equilibrium, there is no interchange between outer and inner, so his entropy is maximal, and so he is psychologically dead, which means that there is no interchange between outer and inner. This can easily happen even in middle age. On the other hand, you can find a person who is getting old and who is still interested in rare stamps, ceramics, pictures, etc. His entropy thereby is lessened. In other words, one should keep up interest, however old one is, in something or other, or one's outer and inner kettles get to the same temperature and no interchange of force between them is possible. Now supposing the work is taken in by a person. He can find a new source of energy. He begins to observe himself, he begins to apply the work ideas to himself, he begins to exchange energy with the work. He ceases to be, say, so self-complacent. He feels more empty, more in need. He begins to see that life is not what he has taken it as. Why does this man begin then to grow again? Because he has reduced his entropy now. He no longer has the entropy coming from false personality and imagination about himself. He begins to see that he is not the person he thought. Instantly energy begins to flow between outer life and inner life into him. A person who is full of self-complacency and filled with his own self-admiration will soon get to a psychological state of entropy which is maximal. As long as he is like that, he will begin to die psychologically. But if he ceases to be so full of self-admiration and makes a place in himself where new ideas can enter, the interchange will no longer be the same, because there is a quite different state of himself and he will get interchange of energy, which means, not death, but life. You know a boring person who is quite content with himself. As long as he has no relationship between the outer kettle and the inner kettle, there is no exchange of energy passing. Once such people begin to see that they have to change themselves, undergo metanoia, no longer regard their inner kettle as they did, they will be beginning to give up an internal psychology which has prevented them hitherto from taking in any new impressions. I remember Mr. Ouspensky once saying to someone, he is so full of self-admiration that he cannot take in anything which might go against his self-admiration, and I think that some of you can realize that state. But if you begin to observe yourself sincerely, from the work point of view, and realize that you are not a good, virtuous woman or man, you will find that you will decrease your entropy and you will find that you are not a good virtuous woman or man. You will make yourself more passive and so energy will flow in from the other sources and give you new energy. All this work is to reduce entropy in yourself. Thinking that you're always right, for example, will increase your entropy, and so approach spiritual death. The Sermon on the Mount is to reduce entropy. Study it carefully. The more you see you are not what you think you are, the more is entropy decreased psychologically in internal life. Every time you see you are wrong, you make it possible for new energy to flow into you. There was a long time ago a school called kenotics. Kenosis means to empty yourself, to let something in. This work also teaches this idea, and the practice of it leads to the reversal spoken of in some of the diagrams. So begin by trying not to be so full of your delightful and charming self.